Our next speaker is actually a founder of the startup society that we're actually in, an entrepreneur that's leading the space, Erick Brimen.
Well, those were pretty awesome words, Joe. Thank you so much, and thank you all for being here. All right, perfect. So some of these slides, I think we'll touch upon a bit of the origin story, what animated Prospera to come into fruition, and where we're going. And also trying to clarify a bit a distinction between Prospera versus just a city. We don't need to go over this too much, but it does bear reminding that the key thing that drives prosperity at city scale is not the buildings themselves, it's the governance underneath it. Charter cities have been created in recent history, but not in the Western Hemisphere, which is where we come in. However, when I say we, it's important to distinguish Prospera as a platform from the cities which are choosing to emerge on the Prospera platform for governance. So as of right now, we have the agreement with Honduras using the Zeve regime and working with other countries to replicate a similar structure within a national sovereign territory to be able to work in partnership and catalyze additional city-scale projects. What we hope to capitalize as a strategy for development is a multi-hub development strategy where right now you are in essence on City 1, future St. John's Bay City. And as we make progress on this one and go from having to do everything ourselves to unleashing the power of decentralized development, we then seed the next hub and replicate the strategy and then seed the third hub and so forth and so on. The only way we can do that is by decentralizing development, and I'll get into that in a second. But first, just for context, where we have decided to start here in Roatan, it's part of the Western Caribbean, out and away from the hurricane lane. And St. John's Bay City, where you are, is a master planned community over 755 acres, designed to house up to 50,000 residents at full development with this densification. But it's not the only hub currently on the Prospera platform. There is a second one on the east end of the island of Roatan, which is currently in early planning stages, and an industrial hub on the mainland of Honduras, east of La Ceiba, which is intended for about 100,000 residents and to be a platform for nearshore. Roatan, by the way, is a great place to get this started, amongst other reasons, because it is an internationally connected island. Hopefully you witnessed that yourselves. But whether it's to Miami and Houston, we're connected to over 44 million people through direct flights. Now, what is this decentralized development strategy that we're piloting and hoping that it will work? Is obviously you need a master plan, just so that you can plan the infrastructure as a whole and you can phase development in what seems to make most sense with the available information today. But instead of trying to, in addition to running governance, doing real estate development ourselves, the master plan serves as an invitation for third-party developers to take on various macro lots that are conceptualized within the larger vision, and they can do something as little, in quotes, a building, or as ambitious as taking over a whole district, such as this one might be, and say, you know what, I am leading a community that wants to go from being primarily online to being on land, and let's go ahead and create a district within the city, whether it's the Vitalia district or otherwise. For what it's worth, our beta district, which is where the beta building got built out and where hopefully some of you have either already been there or will soon visit, it's a perfect starting place for a new district to emerge, having already invested in some of the basic infrastructure, such as Duna that's coming up and should be completed here in the next few months. There's a lot of space. There are great ideas for how to develop the rest of that footprint in a manner that is very friendly and connected with nature, while at the same time bringing forth modern architecture and technology such as robotics and drones and whatever else you can think of, in part thanks to our working relationship with the Circular Factory Group and Zaha Hadid. But that is one potential way for which to develop the district physically. We are right now physically in Pristine Bay, which was a golf resort, which we acquired and completed the transaction late last year after a couple of years of working really hard at it, including fundraising for it. And this then becomes the seed of a separate district, a district that will be focused mostly on residential, with amenities for people of all walks of life, but particularly young families, where at least one of the adults is a business leader, to come and reside here, whether it is because they are starting a brand new business or expanding the business they have, or just working remotely. Now, I wanted to leave some time in the back to answer any questions that you all may have, because that's always generally the best way to focus on what people have in mind. But I will say this, and I want to echo what Joe said earlier. The process of doing in reality what brings us together, of injecting innovation into governance and creating new startup societies and startup cities, is hard as hell. It has not been easy, but it is absolutely worth it. It's absolutely worth it. I cannot think of something that has greater potential to change the course of human history than to fix the thing that either holds us back as civilization or quite literally creates a foundation for all of the innovations that we care about. Quite literally for wealth creation in and of itself to be possible, than solving it. We estimate it's at least $100 trillion a year, probably closer to $200 trillion a year in uncreated wealth, primarily because governance is not solved across the board. You cannot solve it at a national level with politics as they exist, certainly not in a traditional democracy with vested interests and corruption, and the list goes on and on. But we can do it. We can do it if we recognize that the world as is can be a workable space. We cannot fight all the battles at the same time. We can work within the system to some extent, and yet creating a structure that is outside of its traditional operational structure. I've seen projects before we started Prospera, and we were operating as a new way capital, seeking to invest in whatever projects we could find around the world, with fantastic ideas, amazing founders, but completely outside of Maya, most advanced yet acceptable. Look, if we want to make it happen, and you're willing to, what was it that you said, chew on the glass and bend iron, you also have to maximize the chances that you will be successful within the world as is. And as we prove the model out and we show that better governance can be transformational and that it not need be at odds with the system, but rather can empower those that are in power today, I think the world then is transformed. And a great example I can think of is SpaceX and NASA. SpaceX, by any measure, is a direct competitor to NASA, and if they had come to the US and say, NASA sucks, we're going to do it over, NASA would have obviously opposed it, but that's not how they started. They started in a way as a service provider in partnership with NASA. And obviously, at some point, NASA becomes irrelevant, at least this is their initial mission and strategy. So I implore you all to really think about the world as is and push the boundary as much as you can, but staying within what is acceptable. Otherwise, it could be a fool's errand. So any questions in the audience that I could answer real quick?
I think it'd be helpful to hear, if you say better governance, what are the specific features of the Prospera governance platform that you believe lead to it being better governance?
Sure. So, well, first of all, what is governance? We see of it as in 3 dimensions. There is the rules and the administration thereof, and good rules. And that's where I'll, focus most of my answer. But rules and the administration thereof. the resolution of disputes through justice, and security, so that you don't have to be worried so much about your physical integrity and your goods. That's all said fairly easily, and those are the three pillars. Where you have those three pillars, prosperity emerges. Where you don't, it doesn't. You can have more than them. You can also do education. You can do healthcare. Like as liberty-oriented people and libertarians, the idea of the government doing education and healthcare is sort of blasphemy. But the data doesn't show that if governments do those extra things is a net negative for society. It might even be a net positive in some ways. It doesn't matter though. If you don't have those three things and you on top of it try to build roads and schools and hospitals, it doesn't work. So those three things, fine. But what is good rules and the administration thereof? Everything revolves around protection of property rights and individual liberty. Okay? If you want to maximize individual liberty, though, and property rights, you got to deal with negative externalities that can be imposed upon non-consenting third parties. And that is the genesis of most regulation and restrictions. There's this notion that for public health and safety, i.e. negative externalities, you need to control as a government some activities that could be dangerous and then cause harm upon third parties. That's the only moral justification, unless you're going to go flat out communist and get rid of private property and individual liberty. But within that kernel of ethical thinking, you get a crazy bureaucratic state, as the US has become, over-regulating everything. So how do we go about it? Because if you go completely without any regulation, you could end up with a Wild West type environment where you're always ending up in court. There's a lot of fear as to whether or not you can count on your property rights, and if you get hurt, then you have to go and litigate it. Who really wants to do that? So the middle ground that we have designed, it's an open platform of reciprocity when it comes to saying some regulation makes sense, but we're not necessarily going to be at the source of the best regulation for everything. And in any case, there is no such thing as a one-size-fits-all for regulation. And that's why within Prospera you have an open platform where you can pick any existing regulatory framework from any OECD country, plus a growing group of peer countries, and operate under that framework. So basically you choose, and quite literally, in Prospera you can say you have access to the best regulatory framework because you get to choose it. And then on top of it, with time, we enable entrepreneurs and industry leaders to help co-create new regulatory frameworks, but with a huge caveat and difference from the traditional approach. There's no regulatory capture possible within Prospera. So as an entrepreneur, an investor, an industry leader comes forward and proposes a new regulatory framework, they know from the onset that if that is approved, one, it's not the only one that is approved because it sits side by side all the other regulatory frameworks. So you can no longer capture the regulator, if you will, to use anti-competitive measures. But on top of it, because it's one of the approved regimes, it will be available to anybody else that is similarly situated in the industry. Meaning, you as now a stakeholder here in that industry are thinking with a longer term horizon of saying, how should the rules play out so that no bad actors can screw it up for the rest of us while still having maximum liberty to innovate and try new things? Thank you for the question. Joe, there's another couple questions here too in the front.
How do you enforce that people follow the rules without violence?
How do you force that people abide with the rules without what?
Violence.
Oh, without violence. Well, so the idea that you can have civilized society without some measure of coercive force to deal with bad actors doesn't work in reality, at least in my experience. There has to be a measure of coercion available for the good guys to keep the bad guys from violating the rules or taking over by force of their property or stealing or what have you. So if you accept that as a starting principle, and that can be controversial for some, then it's no different than how it works normally. If somebody's not following their contracts or trying to steal, you have a security apparatus initially, and if need be a police force to come and enforce the rules. The big difference, though, is what is the incentive structure of the entity that is one way or another responsible for enforcing the rules. Okay? And in our structure, the incentive is radically different. It's longer term, and it's for profit. And the only way in which a jurisdiction becomes a profitable endeavor for the operator is if it's attractive enough. And it's only going to be attractive amongst other reasons if it not only has good rules, but it actually enforces them without abusing its power. There's no capture and there's no politics, and so the only thing you got left with is competition on the merits of whether or not the conditions on the ground are worthwhile your time and investment.
So how do you enforce it? How do you enforce the rules?
Well, it depends which rules, but there are property registries which can have liens placed upon them. So if he didn't pay your loan, for example, and he gave you his asset as a guarantee, without having to send the police, you take it to arbitration, and if you're right and he's wrong, then his asset that's pledged to you transfers on our property registries to you, for example. So that would be, in a way, a force of law, but no need for, say, the security forces or the police. If on the other hand, somebody's running around with a gun threatening to shoot people, then that person needs to be taken down through an arrest warrant and be put in confinement until the issue can be solved. And ultimately, if they're a Honduran citizen, we have to give them over to the Honduran authorities, or at least we can, and that would be the plan. And if it's a foreigner, we send them off to the country they came from. Yeah. So my questions?
A quick question. One of the goals is to bring people here physically, but most of you guys can see program. What are the benefits of someone being here physically versus being part of the leaders that's program?
Both for taxes and for regulatory benefits, you have to be physically in the jurisdiction in order to claim tax jurisdiction or regulatory oversight. There are some benefits for just being an EU resident, and those are the things that don't need to significantly take advantage of the regulatory framework, and to the extent that you can show that the economic activity is materially happening within the jurisdiction. But if you want to have both maximum tax coverage and maximum regulatory coverage, then you have to be physically here. Because Prospera is a territorial jurisdiction, and the rest of the world generally works that way, except the US when it comes to taxes. But if you're a US citizen, you can do a sandwich through Puerto Rico and still have a very efficient tax jurisdiction in Puerto Rico, but a regulatory jurisdiction in Prospera, for example. Yeah.
How do you guarantee property rights in Prospera, and do you rely on the Honduras government to do so?
No, within Prospera, there is a separation of administration on all layers of what we generally think of as government, down to the property registries. So if you think about how are property rights recognized and adjudicated to begin with, the property registries is one of the biggest instruments that governments use to do that. Who owns it basically comes down to what does the registry say. If the registry says you own it, then you own it. So that's a huge starting point. And so to enforce it and to protect it, then we have to go both to the general legal dimension, which is contract enforcement. Private contracts have seniority over public policy within Prospera. But so then it comes to who is ensuring that the contract is enforced. First is who decides what the right interpretation of the contract is if the parties can't agree, and that's why there's a Prospera Arbitration Center, which serves as a default dispute resolution service provider. You can elect for a different one, and then you're hiring.
Eric, I feel like if you're not answering, if I go and start robbing people in Prospera, and I don't have any property here to have a lien, what happens? Like, at what point is there actual physical armed enforcement in there?
There is a Prospera security force on site, and if you want to test it, then do that and see how well they do. And they're led by Israeli professionals who are good at not necessarily being seen and in your face, but they're good at keeping track of it. But from a legal perspective, the Prospera Arbitration Center is an international arbitration center within the New York Convention. So you might not have property in Prospera, but if you cause harm here and the arbitration center issues an award, that award will chase you pretty much everywhere in the world. And obviously, if it's meaningful enough, there will be a financial significance as to, you go to Germany, we could still enforce that in Germany, the US, and the UK, in pretty much every country as part of the New York Convention.
I'd like to finish my question. I'm curious, like, in the face of this lawsuit going on with the Honduras government, it doesn't end in your favor. But let's say I end up being a property owner here, what does that look like for me?
So property ownership is not what's in question for that arbitration, okay, at a basic level. What is at question is that the current administration would rather not have so much autonomy in the hands of a ZEDE and the promoter and organizer of said ZEDE, i.e. that autonomy that I mentioned is so important. But nowhere is that dispute about whether people can own property or not. So ultimately, if you own property, the expectation is that you'll still own property. You just revert back to a typical Honduran regulatory environment, which is a significant loss of benefits because of the regulatory and the tax implication, but the core of the physical asset is not what's in question. And so if you say we lose, I don't know what that necessarily means, but if Honduras does continue to march forward towards what would be deemed an expropriation, they're going to have a very big bill to pay. And our commitment is transnational and multi-decade. So we hope to be able to succeed here, and we're fully committed to making it happen here and then replicate it elsewhere. But we're not stopping regardless of what happens here. And it's taken more than 10 years to get to this point. Fortunately, I and the team are both relatively young, and then we're working with Vitalia to see if we can make that happen. So it's a matter of, eventually we'll succeed. Look, the world needs this. And it can be the most profitable service that any private enterprise can provide at scale. So if it's highly needed and highly profitable, it will for sure at some point work. It just needs people like us to stay committed and keep trying and trying and trying and keeping the eye on the right ball, okay, which is not just about doing crazy things. I mean, doing quote-unquote crazy things is essential because that's where discovery of new things happens, right? If you do what everybody else is doing, you're not creating much wealth. So it's necessary to enable that, but it's not really just about that, and certainly not about the Wild West or anything like that. It's about demonstrating that at scale, if you innovated this so significant layer of governance, everybody's better off. So we'll get there soon enough.
Hey, everyone, we don't have any more time.
So many, but I'll be around.
Will you be available in the breaks and the future?
I'll be around, yes, and happy to join dinners and all that for AMA type session, but I'll work with you to announce it as it applies. Okay?